Hi, everybody. My name is Kayla Gabehart, and I am the Associate Director of National History Day in Colorado. And today we're going to be talking about mastering the thesis statement. We will do a Q&A at the end, so if you have questions, feel free to put those in the comments. We'll get to those all at the end. And feel free to ask questions about anything you would like to ask a question about, not just the thesis statement or the thesis statement presentation. I can answer any question you could ever think about that's History Day related. And before I get started, I just want to thank Boulder Public Library for putting this on and having me tonight and making sure all the technology was good and ready to go. So with that, I will jump into my presentation here. Let's see. So mastering the thesis statement, we're going to talk a little bit about the steps that you need to craft a really good thesis statement. And we're also going to talk about what a thesis statement is and what a thesis statement is not. And so I just want to point out my email right here. You can always email me about any questions you have. So make sure you write that down. I'll pause right here just for a second so you can write that down. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So first, before we jump into all the nuts and bolts of a thesis statement, let's talk about what a thesis statement is not. So a thesis statement is not a statement of what you already know. So an example of that might be the sky is blue. We know that. That's kind of factual. That's not what we want to do with a thesis statement. It's not a catch-all statement. So we don't want to say that America is the greatest country in the world. Number one, that would be really hard to prove. And we would have to have tons of evidence because it just kind of encapsulates everything. So it's not a catch-all statement, and it's not a grandiose claim, which is sort of similar to a catch-all, but it would be something like, the Great Depression is the worst economic disaster in human history. Again, that's going to be really hard to prove that it was the worst of something compared to something else, especially if we were comparing like the Great Depression to an economic disaster in ancient Greece. It's really hard to compare the different social and economic situation of the time, so we want to avoid statements like that. And it's also not a counterfactual. So a counterfactual is a what-if statement. So that an example of that might be, what if Germany won World War II? We can't say that because it didn't happen. So there's no evidence to support it. So that brings us to what a thesis statement is. So the main thing is a thesis statement is a so what. So what? Why should I care about your topic? Why should I care about what you're talking about? You're really arguing something. So you want to think about it like that. You're not just stating facts. You're making an argument. So it should be falsifiable. And that just means somebody else could take a different opinion and prove you wrong with different sources. If you make a thesis statement that's not falsifiable, you probably won't be able to find sources to back that up, because it's hard to say something definitely happened when we're looking at history because people have different perspectives on it. And it's supported by primary and secondary sources. So primary sources are sources created or written during the time of the event. So that would be something like, let's say we're talking about World War II. We'll use that example again. So that would be newspaper articles from World War II, or maybe poems or journal entries written by World War II soldiers or written to their loved ones back home. It can be all sorts of things, photographs, paintings, maps of battles or something of that nature. Anything from the time or written or created by somebody who lived through that time or that event is a primary source. So let's say your grandma lived through the Great Depression. She would be a primary source on the Great Depression. And then secondary sources are things that historians have written about a topic. So the project that you're making, the History Day project that you're writing about whatever topic you've chosen, that's going to become a secondary source. You're writing about something historical that happened. And so you want both kinds of sources, things from the time and things that have been written about the time after the fact. So the most important thing to remember with your thesis statement before we jump into the nuts and bolts is you have to make an argument. You have to argue something. So how do we write a great thesis statement? And you might be wondering why writing a great thesis statement is important at all. So a thesis statement is really the roadmap for the rest of your project. So if you write a good thesis statement, you're going to be able to organize the rest of your History Day project, no matter what format you do, whether it's a website or an exhibit, a documentary, a paper performance. The thesis maps out the rest of your project. So we really want to make sure we do a good job there, because it's not just a roadmap for us, but also for the people who look at our project. And that includes the judges. So if you're looking to have a really competitive History Day project, You have to have a great thesis statement. That's going to make your project more competitive. Okay, so we have a thesis statement checklist. We have a list of a few things that we absolutely have to have for a thesis statement. And we'll go through these in more detail, but I'm going to run through them now, and then we'll go through sort of a little activity that you could do in your classrooms or at home to make sure that you have all these pieces. Okay, so number one, be specific. We absolutely have to be specific. When you're writing your thesis statement, don't be afraid to change it. Your thesis statement should change or, just undergo little tweaks and edits over the course of your whole project. You might tweak it or edit it 50 times, and that's totally fine. If you're not doing that, you should be concerned because you want your thesis statement to change as you learn new things while you're doing research. So when I say be specific, what I mean by that is don't just say George Washington fought at the Battle of Yorktown. I want you to say General George Washington led the American colonists in their defensive effort at the Battle of Yorktown. So you want to be as specific as you possibly can. If you have a topic about World War II, you could say that it happened in the 1940s, but it would be more specific to give the exact year of the thing you're talking about. So just be as specific as you absolutely can. Whenever you write a sentence, ask yourself, is that specific enough or could I add more detail? Your thesis statement is short. And so you want your judges to have as much information that they need to understand without being overwhelmed as they possibly can in the thesis statement. Okay, step 2. We want our thesis statement to have the 5 W's. So that's who, what, when, where, and why, and sometimes how. It depends on the type of topic that you have, and we'll see an example of that later. So just remember the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why. Who, what, where, when, why. We want to make sure we address all of those characters and actors and questions before we jump into our big, meaty argument. And step 3 is our topic. We want to make sure, and if you're addressing the who, what, where, when, and why, you should have no issues addressing your topic. But we want to make sure that we're super specific about what we're talking about in our thesis statement before we jump into all the meat of our project. We want to make sure our judges and our readers know what we're talking about. So if you're talking about, say, the Marshall Plan, and I'll show you an example using that as a topic in a little while, you want to make sure you say the Marshall Plan and address who the major players were with your 5 W's. So that's super important. Step 4, you want to have the theme words in your thesis statement. Now, I know this is a question we get a lot, so I'll just address it right now. Debate and diplomacy in history. You can address either debate or diplomacy or both. But if you're going to address one or other or both, those theme words need to be in your thesis statement. It's going to help the judges see that you're immediately connecting your topic to the theme, and it's going to help them see what the focus of your project is. So maybe you're really focusing on the debates. Say you do the Abraham Lincoln and Douglas debates. You use the word debate in your thesis statement. Say you're really focusing on diplomacy and you're doing the Treaty of Versailles. You want the word diplomacy in your thesis statement. So just keep that in mind. You can even bold the theme words in your thesis statement. This just draws your reader's eye straight there, and it can be a really helpful way just to keep you on track. So keep that in mind. Okay, step 5, the impacts. So this is where we're really getting into the argument piece of our thesis statement. So before I jump into step 5, let's talk a little bit about the thesis statement. In a lot of situations, you may have been taught that when you're writing a thesis statement, that's one sentence. Well, the argument piece of your thesis statement probably is one sentence, maybe 2. But what you're really writing here when you have the 5 W's, your topic and the theme, and you're being specific in addition to your impacts, is you have a thesis paragraph. So it'll depend on which project type you're doing, how long your thesis is. But let's say you're writing a paper. Your thesis paragraph could be 3 to 7 sentences. It just depends on the topic and how much detail you're putting into that thesis statement. And that'll depend on the topic and how you're formulating the rest of your project. For an exhibit, it's probably going to be closer to 2 to 3 sentences because you only get 500 student-generated words on an exhibit. So just keep that in mind. This is going to be more than just a sentence. It's probably going to be, on average, 3 to 5 sentences, closer to a thesis paragraph. The argument piece is probably going to be a single sentence, maybe 2. So the impacts are our argument. And what we're addressing here in step 5 is 2 types of impacts. So the short-term impact, which is what happened directly after the event. So let's use the example of the Treaty of Versailles. Directly after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to start paying reparations, and that really had economic consequences in their country. So that's the short-term impact. That happened pretty soon after the event, 5 to 8 years. And the long-term impact, why do we care about that today? Why do we care about that the reparations Germany had to pay for World War I, the war payments, had an impact on their economy? Because it was a direct cause of World War II. And that's something that changed the way the world looks today, geopolitically and economically. So that's why do we care today, the long-term impact. You need both of those in your thesis statement to have an argument. So my argument here would be, because the Treaty of Versailles made Germany pay reparations to the other countries for their acts in the war, it had a negative effect on their economy, which led to World War II. So let's just review before we jump into the worksheet piece of this. So number one, be specific. Every time we write a thesis statement sentence, part of our thesis statement, we want to make sure we have as much detail as possible. Number two, we want our 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. Number three, we want to make sure that we've been specific about what our topic is when we're writing that thesis statement. Number four, we want to make sure we use the theme words. Remember, this year it's debate and diplomacy. You don't have to address debate and diplomacy. You can choose one or the other. You can choose both. And step 5 is the argument part of our thesis, the impacts, short-term and long-term. You can also address in the other parts of your project, in the long-term impact section, in the conclusion section, you can say that there were other impacts of whatever your topic is as well. But the ones you put in your thesis, those need to be the focus of your project, okay? Okay, so I'm just gonna get out of my presentation. We're gonna see how this applies in sort of a worksheet format that you can get off of the website at nationalhistorydayincolorado.org, and that you can do yourself in your classroom or at home. So let's first look at this thesis statement checklist here. Make this a little bigger. Okay, so we have talked through all of these things in our slideshow, the pieces of our thesis that we need. So the 5 W's, right? Who is involved? What is the person's nationality and profession? Who are the major players? Are there 2 sides involved? Be specific. Remember, that's another one of our important steps. What? What happened? Address the specifics of your narrowed topic. Be specific. Where? Where did this take place? In the US? In the global political arena? Be specific. You notice a theme here? I'm super serious about being specific. It's really important. When? What year did your topic take place? During what important eras? For example, did your event occur during World War I, the Vietnam War? Be specific. Why? Why did this happen? Were there economic or political tensions? Were there issues regarding equality? Be specific. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So we've talked about being specific. We've talked about our 5 W's. Now we're going to get into the theme before we look at the topic. So the theme is debate and diplomacy. Like I said before, make sure you use the theme words in your thesis. You can bold them, you can underline them, you can italicize them, draw the eye to them. You don't have to pay equal attention to both elements of the theme. So for example, if you're focusing on diplomacy, but you talk a little bit about debate later in your project, that's okay. That's fine. You can talk about debate somewhere else, but make sure if you're going to focus on it, it's in the thesis statement, okay? And then the topic. So here's what I mean by a narrowed topic. We want to make sure that our topic's not too broad or too narrow, the one we end up with in our thesis statement. Ask yourself, for example, can I address this topic in 500 student-generated words on an exhibit board? If not, is it too much or is it too little? So we use the narrowing triangle. So this is just an example, but let's say you're interested in World War II. Okay, there have been hundreds, if not thousands of books written about World War II. We definitely can't talk about it all in 500 student-generated words. So we're going to have to narrow it down beyond that. So let's use the theme to help us narrow it down, right? So for this example, let's use an old theme, which was triumph and tragedy. Okay, triumph and tragedy, what could I address with one of those or both of those theme words? And this is a real example. This student chose concentration camps. Okay, again, concentration camps, there have been probably thousands of books and articles written just about concentration camps. So we have to narrow further. Okay, Otto Frank triumphing over tragedy, and publishing Anne Frank's diary. So that's probably narrow enough. We have our who, Otto Frank and Anne Frank, our what, publishing her diary, our when. We don't have that in this little description here, but we can add it. And why, again, we would need to add that there, but this is probably narrow enough to do in a History Day project. If you get to the bottom of your triangle and you still don't think your topic is narrow enough, keep going. Just because there's 4 slots in my triangle doesn't mean yours can't have more, okay? All right, so let's take this and let's look at a real example that somebody's done. Oh, impacts, I forgot impacts, sorry about that. Short term, what happened immediately after your event? Long term, why do we care today? How does this impact change our lives today? This is the piece that will help shape your argument. Okay, now let's go to a real example. So this example was written by Alexander Weissman, and in 2013, he won the National Gold Medal in junior paper category. So this is a really, really great national award-winning thesis statement. But Alexander was a middle schooler, so if he can do it, I know you all can do it, okay? So his example is, and I'll read it out loud to you, and then we'll go through the pieces of it. In 1947, post-World War II Europe saw the growing threat of communism and declining economies. This economic and political environment caused President Harry Truman and Secretary of State George Marshall to devise the European Recovery Plan, or ERP. The ERP was an economic stimulus program that injected over $13 billion into the struggling economies of Western Europe. This program, now referred to as the Marshall Plan, marked a turning point in American foreign policy. It was a reversal from post-World War I isolationism and generated long-lasting relations with other nations. Okay, so when I read that all together, you'll notice it's not one sentence. It's, let's see, 1, 2, 3 sentences. So he has 3 sentences here in his thesis paragraph, his thesis statement. And it sounds really great when we put it together. But all we have to do in our own thesis statements is make sure we have all the pieces we need. And then we can formulate our own really fancy sounding thesis statement. So let's break down the 5 W's first, and let's see how specific Alexander was, right? So our who, you can see the who is highlighted in yellow. And in this particular topic, this particular thesis happens to have 2 who's. So President Harry Truman and Secretary of State George Marshall. You'll notice how he doesn't just say Harry Truman or George Marshall. He gives the titles of who those people were. So we have a better understanding of why they were involved in this event, right? What is highlighted in green? The European Recovery Plan. He also includes that it was sometimes called the ERP or the Marshall Plan. So you can include those details in your thesis statement. He's very specific here. Where is highlighted in teal. The money went to Western Europe. Now he could have just said Europe, but he said Western Europe because it's more specific and it's more correct. When? Highlighted up here in this pinkish purple color. In 1947, post-World War II Europe. So that when is super specific. He could have just said post-World War II, but he gives us this exact year. So it's really helpful to know what's happening and when it's happening. And why, that's this dark blue color, to inject money into the struggling economies of Western Europe. That's why this Marshall Plan was needed, okay? All right, so he's super specific. When you think about being specific, think back to these examples. The theme. So the theme in 2013, when Alexander wrote this paper, was turning points in history. And so you can see up here in italics, turning point. He says this program, now referred to as the Marshall Plan, marked a turning point in American foreign policy. So I believe in his original thesis, he actually did bold it, but I italicized it here so you could see it. So just keep that in mind. And then the topic. This is how Alexander narrowed down his topic, okay? So his interest was post-World War II. He was interested in a lot of different things that happened after World War II. And so we used the theme to start narrowing that. Okay, what's a turning point that happened after World War II that we could start thinking about? And he was really interested in economics and what happened economically after World War II. And so with that, he decided to focus on the Marshall Plan, which is the topic of his thesis statement. So you can see how that narrowing activity goes. Okay, so we've addressed being specific. We've addressed our 5 W's, the theme, and the topic. So now we have impacts, which impacts are what part of our thesis? The argument. Great. So short term, what happened immediately after? It was a reversal from post-World War I isolationism. And why do we care about it today? It generated long-lasting relations with other nations. So you can see that up here. That's underlined. It's the last sentence of his thesis statement. And just that one sentence has both a short and a long-term impact. So that's going to be really, really important for that. And you can see what happened immediately after. No more isolationism like during World War I in the United States, and generated long-lasting relations with other nations. Now you can see how this would be a roadmap for the rest of his project, right? So in his background section, for instance, he's probably going to need to address World War II and some contextual elements. He's going to need to address President Harry Truman, Secretary of State George Marshall. He's going to need to address Western Europe and why they were struggling so badly after World War II. In the conclusion section, he's going to want to talk more about World War I isolationism and what that means and what it means to end it. He's also going to have to talk about why we care about these long-lasting relations with other nations and what that means to us today and how we think about our relationships with those other nations. So that's what I mean when I say he has a roadmap here for the rest of his project. And you would have the same thing if you include all of these elements. So I'm going to get out of this document and I will make sure that you guys have access to that. And here's another document. So we've gone through all the components, right? Narrow topic, 5 W's, the theme, short-term impact, long-term impact. And through all of those 5 things, we're being specific. And we've looked at the example and we've looked at the thesis statement checklist workshop. Now we have to write our own thesis statement. So here, we're just going to write, we're not going to worry about the argument right now. We're not going to worry about being super specific. We're going to write a summary that describes our narrowed topic and includes the 5 W's, okay? We're just going to draft that right here. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We can go back and read it sentence by sentence and say, could I be more specific here? Could I be more specific here? And we're going to make those edits. That's what I mean by your thesis statement should always be changing, especially as you learn more and you're doing more research. Okay, so we've done this part. Let me just say this part might take you a week or 3 or 4 days. Sometimes this takes a little bit to kind of get your hands around and do a good job at, and that's okay. We want to go back and continue to edit our thesis, okay? Okay, now we're going to reread the above sentences. Maybe I write that on a Wednesday and I don't look at it again until a Friday because I need a break to let my mind kind of recover from all that writing I did. And when I come back to it with fresh eyes, I'll be able to say, oh, I could be more specific here, more specific there. So like I said, you're going to make any necessary revisions or additions. So, Alexander may have originally said the 1940s. His revision or addition would have been 1947 post-World War II Europe. So that's what you're going to do. And then we're going to leave what we wrote above behind for a little while. We're going to identify our impacts. So here you would write your short-term impact. It doesn't even have to be a complete sentence. Maybe you have a couple of short-term impacts that you're thinking about focusing on. Write them down and see how they fit with your long-term impact and the rest of your thesis statement. Then do the same thing with your long-term impact. Write that down. Now let's go back in and add the theme words to our impact sentence. Where can you reasonably swap out language and replace it with debate and or diplomacy? This was an old theme. Where will those fit in my impact sentences? We'll go back and add those. Again, we're just doing revisions. Make those revisions. And then finally, you're going to draft your first complete thesis paragraph. And that's going to have our 5 W's that are super specific, the theme, the topic, the short-term impact, and the long-term impact. So those 5 things and being super specific. And if we have all of those, we have a great foundation to our thesis. We might need to clean it up a little bit here, do some spelling checks, do some grammar and sentence structure things. But if we have the pieces, we can do those things. We can make the technical edits as long as we have the good history pieces. So I think that's going to do it for my presentation. We can go ahead and move to Q&A.
Hi, everybody. My name's Terja Becker, and I'm a librarian at Boulder Public Library, and I help out every year with our Research Rendezvous event, which was last week. I think a lot of you heard about Kayla's presentation at that event, and I'm here in addition to Kayla with my coworker Gina Socia, who is the brain behind Research Rendezvous and coordinates it and runs it every year. We are here to help Kayla answer questions and First off, let me just say to Kayla, thank you very much for being here with us tonight and doing this presentation. And hopefully all of our students out there got a lot of good information from that. And I do also want to say that this has been recorded. So those of you who weren't able to make it for the live presentation tonight will be able to watch it later. And at the end, we will put up our contact email address for the library so that you can ask questions later. Obviously, the Q&A will be live and you won't be able to ask questions if you're not watching it live. So with that, let's go into our Q&A. Could we get the first question up, please? Okay, this question is, how close do I need to be to the word or time limit for my project? Now, Kayla, I imagine that depends on what kind of project they're doing. I don't know if you could answer it for all the kinds of projects, maybe outline the kinds of projects students can do and then answer the question for each if you have the inclination to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So there's 5 kinds of projects you can do. You can do a paper, an exhibit, a website, a documentary, or a performance. And they all have different limits, time limits or word limits. So for a documentary or a performance, though the time limit there is 10 minutes. So 10-minute long documentary, 10-minute long performance. For an exhibit, you get 500 student-generated words. So what that means is student-generated words are the words you come up with on your own. So direct quotations don't count, citations don't count. Anything that is your own words, that's what counts towards your 500 student-generated words. A website, you get 1,200 student-generated words. So it has more web pages, more tabs, so you get a few more words. And then a paper is 2,500 student-generated, or 2,500 words total, I'm sorry. So that would count any quotations that you used. And if you really want to be competitive, if you really want to have a great project, you need to get as close to those maximum limits as you possibly can.
Without going over, I'm assuming, right? Yeah, okay,
yes.
Okay. Okay, great question. What do we have next? Can I change my project between contests? I'm not quite sure I understand if this means you can change your format when you thought you decided on one and now you say you had wanted to do an exhibit, but now you think a paper would be better, or does it mean something else? Maybe Kayla.
Yeah,
it's clearer to you than this to me.
You can make edits to your project between contests. So let's say you win at your school contest and you're moving on to regionals.
Got it.
You can totally make edits to your project. You have to keep the same core idea. So you can even tweak your thesis a little bit as long as your topic and the general ideas are the same. You can't change formats. You also can't change from a group to an individual or an individual to a group project. So you can totally make as many edits as you want. You could even throw away your entire exhibit board and start over, but your core ideas and your topic and your general thesis have to remain the same.
This is just because I don't know the answer to this myself, a follow-up question. Do you get feedback from the judges at every level that you can use to inform, should you move on to the next level, to inform those changes?
Yeah, great question. So you will get feedback from the judges at every level of competition. You'll get an official feedback form where they have strengths and weaknesses, areas for improvement and things that they really liked. And there's also, it's sort of a rubric style. So you could see exactly what they marked you lower on than other portions of your project.
Oh, that's great. All right, next question, please. What is the interview like? Do I need to prepare a presentation?
Yeah, good question. So on the day of the contest, every single project has to be interviewed in the preliminary rounds. So if you're an individual project, you need to show up prepared to do an interview. If you're a group project, at least one member of your group has to be present to do the interview. And what the interview looks like is if you're an exhibit, a website, or a paper, the judges will have looked at your project beforehand. So you'll come in, they've already seen your project or read your project, and they will interview you for 10 minutes. And what that means is that they have a list of questions that we give them that is consistent, and they can ask other questions beyond that, but they have a question guide. And they'll ask you questions and all you have to do is answer them. You don't have to prepare a presentation. You don't need to bring flashcards, nothing like that. So you just go in and you answer their questions. And if you did a good job on your own project, you'll have no problem with that. You'll know all the answers. If you have a documentary or performance, first you'll go in and show your documentary or perform your performance. And then you'll have a 5 to 6 interview because you're there doing your performance. Interviews a bit shorter, but same thing. They'll ask you questions, you answer them. You don't have to prepare anything.
And again, for a well-prepared project, this shouldn't be the most stressful part of the day.
Absolutely. You should practice just so you're confident in your own skills, but the interview is your time to shine. It's your time to show off all the things that you learned while you're doing a History Day project.
All right. Next question, please. Oh, this is an interesting one. What is the most important part of a History Day project?
That's a great question. And I would say there's lots of different important parts, but 3 things that I think are really, really vital and that are a lot of times left out are, 1, what we've been over tonight, a good thesis statement. A good thesis statement will really set apart a good project from a great one. The second part I would say is perspective. So what you want to do in a History Day project is acknowledge that there are different perspectives. So let's say you're doing a project on women's suffrage and you're arguing that women wanted the right to vote and that was a good thing, whatever your detailed thesis statement is. You should acknowledge that some people disagreed. And that's okay. That lends credibility to you because you're acknowledging that there were different perspectives and people thought different ways. So that's definitely something you should keep in mind. You don't have to spend a lot of time on perspective, but just acknowledge it. And then the third thing I would say that's often missing and that is important is the annotated bibliography. So you want to make sure you have a solid bibliography. You have more primary than secondary sources, but both are very important, and that you have complete annotations for every single one of those sources. So you want to make sure every source is annotated. And annotations are a maximum of 3 sentences, so it's not like you have to write pages for each one. But this just lets the judges know, how did you use this source? You didn't just Google something and throw it in your bibliography last minute because you wanted to make it look like you had more things that you researched. And so I've judged at the national contest for several years now, and only 1 project moves out of the preliminary rounds into final rounds at nationals. And many years it's been the bibliography that was the difference. All the projects were great. The difference between 1 and 2 was really the bibliography. So if you're really looking to be super competitive, I would say that's the third thing that is really an important part of the History Day project and is often left out.
Gina, you're muted, I think.
I might just add that also judging even at state and local and regional contests, that judges often, they have competing projects that are very similar in ranking, and the bibliography is often the tiebreaker, the one that pushes one forward. And so it's really important.
If I could throw a follow-up question onto that one, we did have a couple of students at Research Rendezvous asking if there is a preferred style for citations and bibliography. Is it MLA? Is it APA? Or do you just require that the project be internally consistent with the style?
That's a great question. So internal consistency is super important. The accepted styles with national rules are MLA and Chicago/Turabian. They're kind of the same thing. So, but at the state office, we really encourage Chicago. If MLA is your thing and you don't want to worry about learning a new citation source, great. But we're really pushing Chicago because it's the style that historians write in. And it's a style that if you move on to college after high school, it's something that you'll really have to know. So we're really pushing Chicago as our preferred style, but MLA is also totally acceptable.
Excellent. All right. Do we have another question? Okay. Alexis asks, will you have to show your project at every level you go to, or every level you achieve?
Yeah, great question, Alexis. So you will have to present your project at every level you go to. At a specific contest, there might be final rounds if there's lots of projects in the preliminary rounds. So you would show your project at preliminary rounds, be interviewed, and you have to be present. In the final round, there's no interview. So if you move on to finals, you don't have to be interviewed. And you only have to come back for final rounds if you're doing a documentary or a performance, because you have to show it or you have to perform it, right? And then if that was at your regional contest, you would do the same thing when you move on to state. If you move on to the national contest, you would do the same thing. So yes, you show your project at every level.
No pressure or anything. Okay, the next question is, where can I find worksheets like what Kayla used to break down my thesis?
That is a great question. And I am going to really quickly find those on my website. and I will drop them into the chat. So if you want to put up the next question, I can find those really quick.
Okay, while she's looking, do we have another question? Okay, what do I need to focus on if I want to have a chance at winning my contest? And this is a good question because I know some students really just want to get that A and do the assignment for their class, but there are many students who are competitive and would like to move on and win. What sets a winning project apart?
That's a great question. I'm going to put this in the private chat, so this link, so it can be pushed out to you guys. And the titles of the worksheets for the previous question are called Thesis Statement Checklist and Composition Worksheet, so you guys can get at those. So if you want to, what you need to focus on if you want to have a chance at winning your contest, especially at the regional level, you want to make sure that your project is as polished as it can be. Now, it's not going to be perfect. You have limited time between your school contest or your regional contest and the time you started on your project. And you haven't really gotten feedback from outside eyes, right? Like maybe from your peers at school and your teacher, but you might need those outside eyes just to have another look at your project and give you some feedback. So my recommendation would be to make your project as polished as it can be. Focus on those 3 things I just talked about: thesis, perspective, and annotated bibliography. But more than anything, focus on doing good history. So let's say you are doing an exhibit board. You don't really have time to cut out backgrounds for your pictures, like the pretty colored paper that goes behind your words and stuff like that. That's okay. What you should really focus on is the quality of the history in your project, because it's 80% of your score. And, if you need more time later and you want to redo your board and make it really beautiful, really pretty, you can totally do that. You can take that time later, but focus on the history, because that's the foundation of a good project. You can tweak the history a little here and there, but if you just don't have any of that historical background, historical context, it's going to be really hard to do all of that before the next round of competition. And it's going to be hard to do well at your current round of competition.
All right, thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? Okay, I think that might wrap it up. I'm going to ask this one just because I'm curious, both of Gina and of Kayla. Kayla, you've been a judge at nationals, and Gina, I believe you have too. Have you judged at nationals or attended? You've done state though, correct? You're still muted.
No, I haven't done state either, just regionals.
Just regionals. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm curious for both of you, and not to put you on the spot. Hopefully it'll be a fun question. What was the best project you saw ever in all your years doing this, and what made it stand out for you?
Yeah, I can jump in. At nationals, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I saw a project, and it was a junior group documentary, 2 young men. I think they were both 6th graders. And their project was on a small French village that sheltered Jewish children during the Holocaust. And what was so incredible about their project was they had all the nuts and bolts, they had all that great stuff, but they also went and got interviews from some of the children who had lived and grown up.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they were super passionate about their topic. And I think that's why they were driven to go get those interviews and that extra information, because they started out picking something they really cared about and that they really wanted to know about. So that's really important. Don't just do something so you're done. Find something you're passionate about. If you're passionate about football, great. Find a football topic. Everything has a history. Everything can be made into a history topic.
That's really great advice. What about you, Gina? What do you think?
I couldn't really name one that stood out above all others. I do know the ones that do stand out to me are ones that have that kind of unique perspective or that hidden history that you didn't know about in the larger global event. Like just Kayla mentioned, the small French village that harbored Jewish refugees and stuff, and just finding that little uniqueness, and whether it's a small local perspective on something or whether it's just something that you never knew about. I think we had one at Research Rendezvous that was on a Russian woman sniper. That was really interesting because I'd never heard of her, and so it was really interesting when the judges learned something that's really really nice. And I did want to mention that there is for our regional contest, and I believe the state contest also, but the regional one, the Boulder region, there is a local history award, which is a cash prize for junior and senior levels. So, and local is defined broadly as Colorado. So anything that is on a Colorado topic or that focuses on a Colorado topic has a chance to win a local cash prize at regionals.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gina. And we have, I think, 30 or 35 special awards at state. So check out our special awards page on the website if you're having trouble deciding and you need a little inspiration.
Yeah, I think local history is always a great angle to take. And for those of you who might be interested in exploring Boulder local history, we do have our Carnegie local history branch happy to help you with your research. We actually had a student on the East Coast reach out to us for some information about the Sand Creek Massacre for a History Day project. This isn't even one of our local students, and they were referred to Carnegie. So Colorado history has national interest, and I think you'll find a lot of fertile projects if you were to consult with Carnegie. Possibly food for thought for next year. I know most of you have chosen your projects. So, all right, Kayla or Gina, do either of you have any final remarks before we wrap up?
I would just say, be super passionate about what you're exploring, and, that will serve you well. And it's been great, talking to you guys all tonight. Feel free to reach out to me with questions. And a huge, huge thank you to the Boulder Public Library staff. They really did all the hard work on this. And to Gina, she's also your Boulder Regional Coordinator. So she's working really hard behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly for your regional contest. So thank you all so much.
Yeah. And thank you, Kayla, for presenting. We appreciate it very much.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that will wrap it up. We do have our ask@boulderlibrary.org email address if you need more help with your research or would just like to ask our librarians any questions, if there's a book you would like us to try to locate for you. And Kayla's information was on her first slide. If you would like to reach out to her, we can also put you in touch with her. And thanks to everyone who watched tonight and who will be watching in the future, watching the recording. And come see us at the library soon.